Nora Walker had answered 40 letters from men out west, and not one of them had told her the truth. She knew it the moment she read each one, sitting at the small writing desk pressed against the window of her aunt's house in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 1882. The desk was old, the wood worn smooth in the places where her elbows rested, and the window looked out onto a street that smelled of coal smoke and horse dung, and the distant promise of rain that never quite delivered. It was not a bad life. It was simply not a life that felt like hers. The letters had come in response to an advertisement she had placed in 3 different newspapers, including the Cincinnati Enquirer and 2 Western publications that her aunt's neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, had procured with knowing eyes and a tight smile. The advertisement had been modest. Nora had written it herself, because she did not trust anyone else to get the words right. It read, "Educated woman of 26, capable in domestic arts, bookkeeping, and conversation, seeks correspondence with a respectable man of the Western Territories with intention toward matrimony. Character of greater importance than circumstance." She had been proud of that last line. She had thought it would weed out the worst of them. It had not. The 40 letters arrived over 6 weeks, in envelopes stained with red dust and river mud, and once memorably what appeared to be axle grease. They came from Kansas, from Colorado, from the territories of New Mexico and Arizona, from the raw new towns of Texas and the wide plains of Nebraska. Some men wrote well, most did not. But the content of the letters, regardless of the spelling or the elegance of the hand, fell into the same predictable categories. They promised her things. They promised her houses. Fine houses, they said, with glass windows and real wooden floors. They promised her prosperity, horses of her own, dresses from the catalog, a parlor with a proper settee. One man from Dodge City had promised her the finest dining table in Ford County, as though she had been sitting in Cincinnati dreaming specifically of his dining room furniture. Another had promised her that she would never have to work a day in her life, which struck Nora as both improbable and, frankly, undesirable. She liked working. She was good at it. Several promised her safety, which she found equally strange, since no one had asked them about danger. A rancher from the Texas Panhandle had written 3 full pages describing the various ways in which he would protect her from the hardships of frontier life, and by the end of it, she had the distinct impression that he was describing a captivity rather than a courtship. A few promised love, which was the most suspicious of all, because how could any man promise love to a woman he had never met? Love was not a piece of land you could deed to someone. Love was not a horse you could deliver to the depot and say, "Here it is as I promised, sound of limb and gentle of temperament." She answered every letter, because she had been raised to be polite and because she was genuinely trying, but her answers grew shorter as the weeks went on, and by the 35th letter she was essentially writing the same 2 sentences in different arrangements, which amounted to, "Thank you for writing, but I do not believe we would suit." The 36th, 37th, 38th, and 39th letters arrived in a cluster and were dispatched with the same efficient courtesy. She was beginning to think the whole enterprise had been a mistake, that she would spend the rest of her days in Cincinnati mending her aunt's curtains and keeping the household accounts and watching the street from the worn desk when the 40th letter arrived. She almost did not open it. She had developed a system by that point, a kind of triage. She would hold the envelope, feel its weight, note the postmark, and give herself a moment to decide if she had the energy. The 40th envelope was postmarked from a town called Solace, in the New Mexico Territory, which she had never heard of. The handwriting on the outside was plain and even, neither fancy nor careless, just the clear, purposeful letters of a man who had learned to write and used the skill honestly. She opened it. The letter was 1 page. Not 3 pages of promises, not a catalog of possessions or a recitation of accomplishments. 1 page, and even that page was not full. It read, "Miss Walker, my name is Abraham Atkins. I am 30 years old and I run a cattle operation outside of Solace, New Mexico Territory. I will not tell you the house is fine because it needs work. I will not tell you the country is gentle because it is not. I will not promise you prosperity because the land is unpredictable and so is the cattle market. What I can tell you is that I am an honest man and I am genuinely looking for a partner, not someone to fill a role. If you have any interest in corresponding further, I would be glad to hear from you. If you do not, I understand that too. Yours, Abraham Atkins. Nora read the letter twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the street for a long moment, and then she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her with its own arrival. He had not promised her anything. She picked up her pen and wrote back that same afternoon. Their correspondence began in April of 1882, and it was unlike anything she had experienced in the preceding months of reading and answering letters from strangers. Abraham Atkins wrote the way he spoke. She imagined, directly and without ornament, but there was something underneath the plainness that she found herself reaching for in each new letter. He described his days honestly. He told her when things went wrong, which was often enough in the cattle business. He told her about a calf he had lost to a rattlesnake bite, and how it bothered him more than he thought it should, and something about the admission of that feeling made her trust him in a way that none of the glossy promises had managed. She told him things too, things she had not told the other men, because the other men had seemed to be interviewing for a position rather than reaching toward a person. She told Abraham about her parents, who had both died of typhoid fever when she was 17, and how she had come to live with her Aunt Vera, who was kind but vague in a way that sometimes made Nora feel more alone than actual solitude would have. She told him she was good with numbers and had been keeping accounts for 2 local businesses for the past 4 years. She told him she had never been west of Indiana. He wrote back promptly. He always wrote back promptly, she noticed, which she took as a sign of respect. He said that he had come to New Mexico Territory from Tennessee when he was 23, following a friend who had since moved on and left Abraham there with a small piece of land he had bought for almost nothing, and the slowly growing conviction that this was where he was going to stay. He said the sky in that country was something that could not be adequately described in a letter, and that he hoped she might see it someday. She had read that sentence 4 times. By June, they were writing twice a week. By July, she realized she was looking for his handwriting among the letters that arrived each day with the kind of anticipation she recognized, but had never before experienced in herself. It was not comfortable exactly. It was more like the feeling of something waking up, which is to say there was some aching in it alongside the pleasure. Her Aunt Vera noticed. Nora Walker was a small, precise woman of 53 who had never married and was entirely content with that fact, and who had been cautiously supportive of the advertisement and the letters while privately, Nora suspected, believing the whole endeavor was unlikely to produce anything worthwhile. But she noticed the way Nora's face changed when she collected the mail, and one evening over supper she set down her fork and said, "Is it the one from New Mexico?" Nora looked up. "What do you mean?" "The one that makes you look like that," Vera said. "Is it the one from New Mexico?" Nora did not pretend to misunderstand. "His name is Abraham Atkins." Vera picked up her fork again. "Is he decent?" "I believe he is. Belief is not certainty." "No," Nora agreed, "but I have read 41 letters from Western men and I know the difference between a man performing decency and a man practicing it." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When is he asking you to come?" "He has not asked." Vera looked at her with the expression she reserved for arithmetic errors. "Then perhaps you should tell him you are considering it." It was not, Nora thought later, the worst advice she had ever received. She did not take it immediately. She waited 2 more letters, watching to see if anything in Abraham's writing would change, if the steadiness of it was a performance that would crack eventually. It did not crack. In August he wrote to her about a drought that was threatening his summer grass, and the difficult calculations he was making about which cattle to sell early and which to keep, and there was something in the frank recitation of trouble that convinced her entirely. He was not writing to impress her. He was writing to her, which was a different thing altogether. She wrote back and told him she was willing to come to Solace if he was still of a mind to meet. She told him she was not making any promises either, that she thought they should meet first and see if the person matched the letters, and that if they suited she would consider his situation seriously, but she would not arrive already decided. His answer came back 11 days later, which was faster than she expected given the distance, and it said, "That is exactly the right way to go about it. I will meet you at the depot in Las Cruces on whatever date you name. I will be wearing a gray hat and I will be standing by the horse, not on it, so you can see my face clearly before you have to speak to me." The last part made her laugh again. She was developing a real affection for the way he thought about things. She named the date in September, gave herself 3 weeks to prepare, told her aunt, wrote to Abraham with the train information, and began to be afraid in a way that was deeply inconvenient and entirely understandable. The fear was not of Abraham specifically, or not only of Abraham. It was of the magnitude of what she was doing. She was leaving Cincinnati, where she had lived for 9 years, where she knew the shape of the days and the names of the neighbors and the route to the market without thinking. She was going to a territory she had never seen to meet a man she had never met and consider whether she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. It was rational to be afraid. It was, in fact, the only rational response to the situation. But she had spent enough time in that small bedroom in her aunt's house, looking at the street from the worn desk, to know that safety and rightness were not always the same thing. She had been safe in Cincinnati. She had not always felt right there. And there was Abraham's letter sitting in the box where she kept them all, the first letter, the one that had not promised her anything, and when she read it again she felt the same clarity she had felt the first time. She was going. The train journey from Cincinnati to Las Cruces, New Mexico Territory, took 4 days and involved 3 connections, 2 of which were managed without incident, and 1 of which required Nora to sit in a depot in Amarillo, Texas, for 7 hours while a wheel on the next train was replaced. She used the time to read and to watch the country change around her, and the country changed dramatically. By the time she was on the final leg of the journey, the green rolling landscape of Ohio and the grasslands of the Kansas plains were behind her, and the terrain had become something entirely different, high and brown and stark, cut through with the shadows of mountains that were larger than she had imagined mountains to be. The light was different too, exactly as Abraham had suggested it would be, brighter and cleaner, and so present that it seemed almost like a physical substance, something you moved through rather than just saw by. She arrived in Las Cruces on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of September 1882, and the heat on the platform when she stepped off the train was a living thing. She stood with her 2 large bags and her smaller travel case, and adjusted her hat and looked along the platform for a man in a gray hat standing beside a horse. She saw him immediately. He was taller than she had imagined, which was unfair because he had described his height nowhere in the letters. He was standing about 30 yards away at the edge of the platform, holding the reins of a bay horse with one hand, and watching the passengers step down from the train with a careful, patient expression. He had taken his hat off, which she realized a moment later was deliberate, so she could see his face before he saw her. The hat hung from his other hand by the brim. His hair was dark brown and his face was weathered, and there was something in his expression that was neither eager nor guarded but simply attentive, the expression of a man who was paying genuine attention to the world in front of him. Then he saw her. She knew the moment he did because something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible from a distance, but she was not at a distance. It was a kind of settling, as though something that had been held in careful suspension had gently released. He put his hat back on and walked toward her. "Miss Walker," he said, when he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. "I'm Abraham Atkins." "I know," she said, and then felt slightly foolish for saying it. The gray hat. The gray hat, he agreed. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile yet, but it was the early stage of one. How was the journey? Long, she said honestly. And interesting, the country is very different here. It is. He looked at her bags. May I take those? She handed him the two large ones and kept the travel case herself, and they walked off the platform together toward a wagon he had left at the hitching rail at the side of the depot building. The bay horse was tied behind the wagon, and there was a second horse already in the traces, a sturdy gray with a calm eye. It is about 4 hours to Solace, he said, loading her bags into the wagon bed with efficient care. We will stop in Mesilla for water and you can stretch your legs if you need to. That would be welcome, she said. He helped her up to the wagon seat without making a production of it, just a steadying hand that was there and then was not, and climbed up himself and took the reins, and they pulled away from the depot into the afternoon light. They did not talk immediately, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was the first thing she noted with quiet relief. She had been half afraid that all of the ease of the letters would evaporate in person, that they would sit beside each other with nothing to say, and the whole elaborate construction of their correspondence would prove to have been illusion. Instead, the silence felt like an extension of the letters, like the natural pause between one sentence and the next. You left your hat on the whole train, I suppose, he said after a while, not looking at her, watching the road. Yes, she said. My aunt told me to keep it on. Smart woman your aunt, she is. She told me to tell you that if you were anything other than what you presented yourself to be in your letters, she would come to New Mexico and address the matter personally. He looked at her then briefly, and this time the corner of his mouth went all the way to a smile. I believe her. You should, Nora said. They stopped in Mesilla as he had said they would, and she walked around the small plaza while he watered the horses, and she bought a cup of coffee from a woman selling food from a cart, and she looked at the mountains to the north and the west and felt something in her chest that she could only describe as expansion, as though the largeness of the landscape was requiring her to be larger inside herself to accommodate it. Abraham found her standing at the edge of the plaza looking at the mountains and stood beside her for a moment without speaking. The organs, he said finally, meaning the range to the east. They are extraordinary, she said. They are, he agreed. Wait until you see them at sunrise. It was such a simple thing to say, and it assumed a future in which she was there at sunrise, and it was said without calculation, just as a matter of fact, and she thought, yes, I want to see that. The road to Solace took them further north and then east, through country that was dry and beautiful in equal measure, the scrubland dotted with juniper and pinon, and the occasional cottonwood tree golden and trembling in the afternoon heat along the dry arroyos. They talked more easily as the journey went on. He told her about the land he ran, about 600 acres with a creek that ran most of the year and enough grass in a decent year to support a good-sized herd. He had 60 head of cattle currently, was hoping to grow that to 100 by the following spring if things went well. What does going well entail? She asked. No drought past October, reasonable prices at the fall market, none of my stock deciding to find their way through the fence to the open range, he said. The fence needs work. It is on the list. What else is on the list? He thought about this for a moment with the seriousness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. The east side of the barn roof. The pump housing. The main room of the house needs plastering on the interior of the north wall, a kitchen stove that does not fight you when you use it. You said in your letter that the house needed work, she said. I was not exaggerating. I appreciated that you said it. Most of the other letters I received described houses of extraordinary quality. He glanced at her sideways. Other letters. I placed an advertisement, she said, feeling no reason to be anything other than straightforward about it. I received 40 letters over 6 weeks. Yours was the last. He was quiet for a moment. How many did you answer? All of them. I was raised to be polite. And you wrote to me. I wrote to you, she confirmed. He looked at the road ahead. I am glad, he said simply, and that was all he said about it, and she was glad he did not press for more. They arrived in Solace as the sun was getting low, the light going amber and long across the land. Solace was not large. It had a main street with a general store, a feed and hardware outfit, a blacksmith, a small hotel, a saloon, and a building that served as both the sheriff's office and the town jail. There was a church on the northern end of the street and a schoolhouse at the southern end, and scattered around the edges of this central spine were the homes of perhaps 300 people, some in proper houses and some in adobe structures, and a few in arrangements that were optimistically described as houses, but were perhaps something less. Abraham drove through without stopping, nodding to a few people who looked up as the wagon passed, and continued east down a road that narrowed as the town receded, until they came to a gate in a fence line and turned in through it. The house was at the end of a short lane bordered by 2 cottonwood trees that were old enough to be substantial. The house itself was adobe, low and broad, with a covered porch along the front. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it had a solidity to it that she liked immediately. The thick walls and the small windows set deep in their frames, and the way the whole structure seemed to have grown from the ground rather than been placed upon it. She could see the problems he had mentioned. One corner of the porch roof sagged slightly. The north wall of the house, even from the outside, had a long crack running from the roofline toward the ground. But there was a kitchen garden to the east side that was larger and better tended than she had expected, and the yard was clean, and through the open front door she could see that the interior was swept and orderly. He had cleaned for her arrival. She noticed this, and it moved her, the simple domestic care of it. He helped her down from the wagon and showed her inside, carrying her bags in again without being asked. The main room was low-ceilinged and warm with the stored heat of the day, furnished plainly but sufficiently. A table, 4 chairs, a shelf of books, a fireplace that still held the ghost of a winter's worth of fires in its stones. The kitchen was at the back, and beyond that a short hall led to 2 rooms. He showed her one of them, a bedroom with a narrow bed and a window that looked east toward the mountains, and told her it was hers for as long as she was a guest and as long as she needed. "The other room is mine," he said, with the same straightforward quality that characterized everything he did. "I want you to be comfortable. This arrangement is proper, and I intend to keep it that way until you have decided what you want to do." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the room, hat in hand again, and the last of the day's light was coming through the east window and laying itself across the floor between them. "That is an honorable way to handle it," she said. "It is the only way I know how to handle it," he said. She unpacked her smaller travel case that evening while he tended the horses and cooked supper, which he had told her he was going to do, and that she should not argue about it because she had been on a train for 4 days. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread, and it was better than it had any right to be. They ate at the table in the main room with the door open, and the night coming in cool and fragrant with sage and the distant smell of the mountains, and outside the stars appeared with a profligacy that she had not expected, so many of them and so bright that they seemed to require some kind of response. "The sky," she said, when they had finished eating and were sitting with the remains of the coffee he had made. "Yes," he said, "you were right that a letter could not prepare me for it." "Letters can prepare you for a great many things," he said, "but not that." She looked at him across the table. "What else can they not prepare you for?" He considered the question with his habitual care. "The smell of the land after rain," he said, "the sound the cattle make in the evening, the way a fire sounds at night when the wind is quiet." He paused. "The way a person looks when they are right in front of you instead of just words on a page." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at her coffee cup. "Yes," she said, her voice very even. "That too." She woke the next morning before the sun had fully risen and lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch coming to life outside. A horse shifting in the corral, the far-off low of a cow, the soft percussion of Abraham moving around in the kitchen. She pulled on her clothes and found him there, already dressed for the day, stirring something on the stove. He turned when she came in and said, without any particular surprise at her early rising, "Coffee is made. Do you want to see the sunrise?" She did want to see the sunrise. They stood on the porch together in the cool blue morning and watched the light come up over the mountains to the east, and it was, as he had implied, something that no letter could have prepared her for. The mountains went from black to gray to the most extraordinary copper and rose, and the sky above them was a deep, saturated blue that gradually lifted and brightened as the sun climbed, and the whole plain between the house and the mountains was washed in a light that seemed to come from within the land itself rather than from above it. She was aware of him standing beside her, not close, leaving a respectful distance between them, but present and quiet, and watching the same thing she was watching. "I see why you stayed," she said. "It is not only the sky," he said, "but the sky is part of it." That first day she asked to be shown the ranch, and he showed her all of it, walking with her to the creek that ran clear and low in the late summer heat, through the pasture where most of the cattle grazed in the warm morning, along the fence line that did indeed need work, to the barn where he kept the horses and his tools, and the small mountain of equipment and supplies that constituted the practical infrastructure of the operation. He explained things carefully and answered her questions, and she had many questions because she was genuinely interested, and because she had come here to understand what she was considering. She asked about his finances with a directness that might have surprised another man. How much did he carry in debt? What were his expenses against his income in an average year? What were his plans for expansion and over what timeline? He answered all of it without defensiveness, pulling out a ledger from the shelf in the main room and going through it with her at the table, and she saw immediately that his accounting was rough but his fundamentals were sound. He was not rich and he had some debt from the cattle he had purchased to build the herd, but the land itself was paid for, and he was running a modest surplus in good years. "You know bookkeeping," he said, watching her trace a column of figures with her finger. "I have been doing it professionally for 4 years," she said. "Your accounts are not in bad shape, but you could organize them more efficiently, if you wanted." "I would want," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," she said, and this somehow felt like a step across a threshold. There was a moment in the middle of the second day when she realized she had stopped evaluating and started simply being there, and that the transition had happened so gradually she had not noticed it until it was already complete. She was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds, which she had offered to do that morning because the garden clearly needed attention, and she needed something to do with her hands, and the sun was warm on her back and the earth was fragrant and dark where the irrigation had kept it moist, and Abraham was somewhere in the barn and she could hear the sound of him working, and she thought, "I could live this life." It surprised her how completely she meant it. The town of Solace introduced itself in pieces over the following days. The proprietor of the general store, a wide and cheerful man named Dale Morrow, greeted her with frank curiosity and warmth when Abraham brought her in for supplies. "We have heard you were coming," Dale said, with the satisfaction of someone who considers news the community's property. Abraham talked about nothing else for 2 months. Abraham looked at the shelf of flour sacks with great interest. "Did he?" Nora said. "Did not talk about it to just anyone," Dale clarified, either not noticing or generously ignoring Abraham's expression. "Just mentioned he was expecting company." There was a woman named Rosa Vega who ran the laundry and dry goods on the south end of the main street, and she came out to say hello when Nora walked past, her 3 children observing from the doorway with the interested solemnity of small people witnessing something they could not yet categorize. Rosa had come north from Chihuahua with her late husband 12 years ago, and she spoke English with a precision that suggested it was a language she had worked hard to acquire and used with care. She and Nora liked each other immediately, the kind of liking that does not require any particular event to establish itself but is simply present, like a door that opens before you reach it. There was also the sheriff, a man named Pat Glendon, who was lanky and gray-haired and had the permanent squint of a man who had spent 40 years reading the horizon. He tipped his hat to Nora when Abraham introduced them and said, "Solace is a decent town, Miss Walker. We have our troubles same as anywhere, but it is a decent town." He said this with the emphasis of a man who had worked to make it true and was not inclined to take the credit lightly. She was beginning to understand Solace. It was the kind of place that existed in the gap between the romanticized notion of the West and the harder reality of it. Not lawless exactly, but not entirely tame either. A community that was making itself up as it went along and doing a creditable job of it under the circumstances. She had read enough about the territories to know that things had been worse here not so many years ago, and were still difficult in ways that were not always visible. She had seen the Apache family camped at the edge of town when she and Abraham rode in one evening, and she had asked him about it. And he had told her that the Mescalero had been moved to the reservation at Chilarosa a decade ago, but that some families still moved through their old territory, tolerated in some places and not in others. He said this with a flatness that she understood to carry a judgment, an acknowledgment of an injustice that did not require amplification from him because the facts spoke plainly enough. It was their country, she said. Yes, he said. It was. She appreciated that he did not argue with the fact or dress it up in the language of progress. On the fourth day, when they had ridden out together to check the herd on the south pasture, and were sitting their horses on a small rise looking out over the cattle grazing below, Abraham said, without preamble, "I like you, Nora. I liked you in your letters, and I like you more now that I have met you. I think you are the most sensible and the most interesting person I have met in a long while, and I do not want you to go back to Cincinnati if there is any possibility of you staying." She looked at him. He was looking at the cattle, not at her, with the particular expression of a man who has said the thing that needed to be said, and is now prepared to receive whatever comes back. "I like you too," she said, "very much, and I think I want to stay." He looked at her then. "But I want to say it clearly," she continued, "so that there is no misunderstanding. I am not staying to fill a role. I am not staying to be your cook or your housekeeper, though I am willing to do those things as part of a genuine partnership. I am staying because I think you are a person worth staying for, and because this place has gotten under my skin in 4 days in a way that no amount of describing it in a letter could have managed. And I want us to be honest with each other always, the way we were in the letters, because that is the only way I know how to do this." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with the full weight of his attention. "That is exactly how I want to do it," he said. "Then we are agreed," she said. "We are agreed," he said. He asked her properly a week later. They had been in Solace for what felt like longer than 2 weeks because so much had happened in the small compass of the days. She had reorganized his accounts and found him a better system for tracking the cattle and the pasture rotation. She had replanted 2 beds of the kitchen garden. She had fixed the loose board on the porch that had been catching at his boot every morning when he went out. She had sat with him at the table after supper more evenings than not, reading or talking or sitting in the comfortable silence that had started in the wagon from Las Cruces and never quite gone away. He came in from the evening feeding on a Thursday, washed his hands at the pump, and came into the kitchen where she was finishing the supper dishes and stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment and said, "Nora." She turned around. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I am not going to tell you it will be easy or that I can promise you anything grand. The house still needs work and the fence still needs work and the cattle business is unpredictable. But I am asking because I genuinely want you as my wife and my partner and the person I talk to every day for the rest of my life, and I think we could build something good here together." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and the supper smell still hung in the air, and outside the window the stars were just beginning to appear. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Abraham." He let out a breath that she thought he might have been holding for several days. They were married in the Solace Church 3 weeks later by the Reverend Henry Pitts, who was a small, serious man with a large, serious Bible, and who conducted the service with a dignity that was appropriate to the occasion, without being theatrical about it. The town turned out, because a town of 300 people did not have such an abundance of celebrations that it could afford to neglect one, and Dale Morrow from the general store brought a cake his wife had made, and Rosa Vega came with her children and pressed Nora's hands warmly between both of hers before the ceremony, and Sheriff Glendon stood at the back with his hat over his heart and looked, for a man of permanent squint, extremely pleased. Nora wore a dress she had brought from Cincinnati, a deep blue wool chally that had been her best dress for 3 years, and she had altered it slightly in the weeks before the wedding, taking in the waist and adding a small collar of cream-colored cotton that she had found in the bulk goods at the general store. She had pinned her hair up with her mother's tortoiseshell combs, which she had carried in her travel case all the way from Cincinnati and which were the best thing she owned. And when she came down the aisle on her own 2 feet, because there was no one to walk with her since her father was gone, and her aunt was in Cincinnati, and she had decided she did not need to be delivered by proxy, Abraham looked at her with an expression that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the theatrical look of a man overcome by spectacle. It was the look of a man who recognized something, as though the person walking toward him confirmed something he had suspected but not been certain of until this moment. The ceremony was brief and real. The vows were the traditional ones, which were, she thought, exactly right, promising not comfort or prosperity or ease but fidelity and presence, which were the things that actually mattered. He put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that had been his mother's, which he had told her about beforehand in case she objected to it being a second-hand ring, and she had told him that was the most beautiful possible origin for a wedding ring, and she was honored to wear it. They walked out of the church into the October afternoon together, and the town of Solace made a reasonable noise of celebration, and Dale Morrow's wife's cake turned out to be excellent. The first year of marriage was the education neither of them had expected, and both of them needed. Not difficult in the way that made people grim about it afterward, but genuinely taxing, the way any real work is taxing when you are learning it. They were 2 people who had lived alone, in very different circumstances, for long enough that the adjustments of shared life required real attention. There were negotiations about small things, the temperature of the house in the mornings, which she preferred cooler and he preferred warmer, the hours of work and rest, the question of which decisions were made individually and which together. Abraham had a habit of going silent when he was troubled rather than speaking, which she found maddening for the first 2 months until she learned that the silence was not withdrawal but a kind of processing, that he would come out the other side of it with something worth hearing. She, in turn, had a habit of making decisions without consulting anyone because she had been effectively making all her own decisions for 9 years, and this occasionally resulted in situations where she had already arranged something he might have arranged differently. They talked about these things, sometimes with friction, always with the underlying honesty that had been their foundation since the first letter. He would say, "I needed to be part of that decision." She would say, "I need to know you will tell me when something is wrong," and they would work it through and come out on the other side of it closer for having done so. The fence got fixed in October, Abraham and a hired hand named Tomas working along the south boundary for 4 days while the weather held. Nora brought them their midday meal in the field and sat with them in the shade of the wagon and talked with Tomas about his family in the Rio Grande Valley, and by the end of it, she had learned that Tomas's wife was an excellent seamstress and was looking for work, and had arranged between herself and Tomas that his wife Maria would come to the ranch 2 days a week to help with the larger sewing projects in exchange for cash wages. Abraham heard about this arrangement when he came in for supper. "You hired Maria Vargas," he said. "I arranged employment," she said. "She needed work. I have more sewing than I can manage alone. It benefits both households." He looked at her for a moment, "What do we pay her?" she told him. He thought about it. "That is fair," he said. "I know it is fair," she said. "I was careful about it." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know you were," he said. The north wall got plastered before the first hard cold came, a job that Abraham undertook himself over 3 evenings, mixing lime and sand in a bucket in the yard and working it into the cracks with a wooden float. She held the lantern for him when the light faded and handed him tools when he needed them, and they talked while he worked, the easy, wide-ranging conversation of two people who have learned that they genuinely like talking to each other. He told her about the early years in New Mexico, when he had been 23 and alone, and not entirely sure he had not made an enormous mistake. She told him about the years after her parents died, the strange suspended time of grief and adjustment that had eventually resolved itself into the life in Cincinnati that was fine but not fully hers. "Did you know you wanted to leave?" he asked, smoothing the plaster over a deep crack near the window. "I think I knew I was waiting for something," she said. "I did not always know what." He looked at her over his shoulder. "And now," she held the lantern up a little higher so the light fell better on the wall. "Now I am not waiting," she said. The winter in the New Mexico territory was not the brutal, prolonged affair that winter had been in Ohio, but it had its own character, the nights going genuinely cold and the occasional norther coming through with enough force to rattle the windows and send the cattle crowding against the southern fence line for wind shelter. There were weeks of gray sky and wind, and the particular tedium of indoor winter, and Nora discovered that she and Abraham navigated the tedium differently. She turned to books and correspondence and the reorganization of the household accounts, while he turned to the physical work of maintenance, finding things to mend and repair in the barn, and the equipment shed when the weather kept him close to the buildings. On the long evenings they read to each other, which had been her suggestion, offered tentatively because she was not sure if he would find it awkward. He had not found it awkward at all. He had said with quiet pleasure that no one had read to him since his mother died, and that he would very much like it. She read to him from the books on the shelf, which included a beat-up copy of Washington Irving's Tales of a Traveler, a Bible, a soil and water management manual that was not as dull as it sounded, and 2 novels that a previous owner of the shelf had left behind. He read to her from a new book he had ordered from Dale Morrow, which was a collection of natural history essays about the Southwest that she found so interesting. She sometimes took the book from him and continued reading silently while he laughed at her. She wrote to her Aunt Vera through the winter, long detailed letters about the ranch and the town and the days, and Vera wrote back with the dry precision characteristic of her, reporting on the Cincinnati news without sentimentality, but with a thoroughness that made Nora feel connected to the East in a way that was comfortable rather than longing. Vera sent her a package at Christmas containing a tin of good tea, a pair of gloves lined with rabbit fur, and a note that said, "You sound happy." That is the only news I needed. Nora had to put the note down for a moment before she could read it again, because her eyes had unexpectedly blurred. Spring came in March, slowly and then with conviction. The creek came up with the snowmelt from the mountains, and the grass pushed through the winter-dried ground, and the cattle grew restless and vocal with the season. Abraham started talking about the spring cattle drive to the market in Lincoln, with the focus of a man making calculations he had been building toward for months, and she sat with him over the accounts and helped him think through the numbers, and they decided together to sell 30 head this spring and hold the younger stock through the summer for fall market. Together was a word she had become more conscious of in the months since the wedding. She had not expected to feel so exactly the partnership she had described when he asked her, and it moved her, the way it had actually become that. He consulted her genuinely, not as a courtesy, the way some men consulted women as a courtesy while having already decided. He brought her the actual problems and expected the actual help, and she gave it, and the help was useful, And this was the basis of something that she had begun to understand was rarer and more valuable than she had been told love was supposed to be. She had been told, in the soft instruction of her girlhood, that love was primarily a feeling, that it arrived and swept you up and was its own justification. She believed in the feeling. She had the feeling. But what she had discovered in the first months of her marriage was that the feeling was the visible surface of something much more structural. The feeling sat on top of the daily acts of respect and consultation and honesty and willingness to be corrected and capacity to apologize and actual interest in the other person's interior life. And without those things, the feeling would have been rootless. With them, it was growing into something that seemed to her more substantial than any of the promises that had come in 40 letters from men she had never met. Abraham's hand on her shoulder one evening in April when she was working on the accounts and had been staring at the same column for too long, the gentle pressure that meant without words, "Come away from that, it will still be there tomorrow, come and sit with me for a while." That was love, she thought, that knowing. She was expecting their first child by late spring. She told him on a May morning when the kitchen garden was just beginning to come up, and the cottonwood trees by the lane were in full leaf, and the air smelled like new growth and warm earth. She had known for several weeks, had waited until she was certain, and had practiced different ways of saying it, and then abandoned all of them for the simple version. "I believe we are going to have a child." He was standing by the stove with his coffee cup, and he went very still for a moment. And then he set the cup down carefully on the table and came to where she was standing and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was startling from hands so accustomed to the roughness of ranch work, and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "Nora," just her name, but the way he said it. She put her hands over his and they stood like that for a moment in the May morning, the garden beginning outside the window and the whole future arranging itself around them. She wrote to her Aunt Vera that same day. The letter was short because the news was the whole letter. "Dear Vera, you are going to be a great-aunt. All is well. Love, Nora." Vera's reply came back 3 weeks later and consisted of exactly the following. "I am coming to visit in the autumn. Do not argue with me. I will bring the good tea. Love, Vera." Abraham read the letter over her shoulder and said, "I would very much like to meet your Aunt Vera." "She will like you," Nora said. "She likes people who do not make unnecessary promises." "Good," he said. "I have very few promises to make." "I know," she said. "It is one of the things I love about you." She had said the word before, in letters and in spoken conversation, but this time it landed differently, or he received it differently, because he looked at her with an expression that was open in a way that she associated with the moments when he let himself be wholly present rather than slightly managed, and he said, "I love you too, in case I have not said it clearly enough." "You have said it clearly," she said. "You say it every day in about 15 different ways." "Then I will say it one more way," he said, and kissed her there in the main room in the mid-morning light with the windows open and the cottonwoods moving in the warm wind outside. The summer of 1883 passed in the way that a summer does when a person is growing large with child, and the land is doing its own growing around her, and time seems to move with both extreme slowness and extreme speed simultaneously. The heat was formidable from July onward, and she learned the territorial art of avoiding the hottest part of the day and working in the mornings and evenings, and she learned to drink more water than she had ever thought necessary, and to sleep in the afternoon when the house was at its hottest. Abraham was vigilant without being overbearing, which was the delicate balance she had needed him to find, and which, to his credit, he found almost immediately. He did not treat her as though she had become fragile. He simply noticed things. That the water bucket by the garden was too heavy for her to carry comfortably and put a second one closer to the pump. That the step up to the porch was awkward at a certain angle, and repaired it one afternoon without mentioning it. That she needed more sleep than she was inclined to allow herself, and had become an ally of the afternoon rest in a way that she found both touching and slightly amusing. Rosa Vega came to visit twice a month, and brought practical wisdom and excellent company in equal measure. Rosa had 3 children, and had given birth to all of them in the territory and knew things about the practical management of the situation that Nora had not known to ask about, and she shared them with the directness of a woman who believes useful information is too valuable to be coy about. There was a doctor in Lincoln, which was 20 miles from Solace, a man named Dr. Thomas Hargrove who had trained in Philadelphia and come west for reasons he did not fully explain, but which seemed to involve a combination of idealism and the kind of restlessness that the East sometimes produced in people. Abraham drove Nora to see him in July and again in September, both times the round trip taking a full day, and Dr. Hargrove pronounced her healthy and the baby's progress normal, and said that the birth would probably come in late November or early December, and that she should send for him when the time came. Vera Walker arrived in October, as promised, by train to Las Cruces and then by stage to Solace, and descended from the stage with 2 large trunks and the air of a woman who has decided to be pleased by what she finds. She was 54 now and looked exactly like herself, small and precise and dressed in sensible dark wool, and she looked at Nora for a long moment and then said, "You look well. You look more than well. You look like yourself." "I am myself," Nora said, "more than I have been in a long time." Vera looked at Abraham, who was standing slightly behind Nora with his hat in his hand in the attitude of a man being assessed, which was accurate. "Mr. Atkins," she said. "Mrs. Walker," he said, because Vera had kept the name of a husband who had died early and preferred to retain it. "We are very glad you are here." Vera looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Nora. "He will do," she said, in a tone that suggested the assessment was a good one regardless of its brevity, and Nora laughed and Abraham looked quietly pleased. Vera stayed for 6 weeks, sleeping in the room that had been Nora's room when she first arrived, which Abraham had furnished more fully in anticipation of the visit. She was an excellent guest in the sense that she required very little accommodation and contributed enormously, taking over certain household tasks with a competence that freed Nora considerably in the last weeks of the pregnancy, and engaging Abraham in long conversations in the evenings about everything from ranch management to the history of the New Mexico territory, during which Vera demonstrated that she was as well-read as she had always been, and Abraham discovered that he enjoyed being challenged in conversation. "Your aunt is a remarkable person," he told Nora one evening when Vera had gone to bed. "She always has been," Nora agreed. "She raised me, really, after my parents died." She never said it that way, but she did. "She is very proud of you," he said. "She does not say that either." "No," said Nora, "but she says other things instead. It is how she works." The baby came on the 2nd of December 1883, a Monday night and into Tuesday morning, with Dr. Hargrove in attendance after a hard ride from Lincoln and Rosa Vega present and entirely competent as a secondary authority. Abraham spent the night in the main room, which was where he had been firmly directed by both Rosa and Vera, and Nora could hear him moving occasionally, slowly, and with the measured pacing of a man doing his best not to come through the door, and the knowledge of him there, patient and present on the other side of the wall, was a comfort through the long hours. The baby arrived just after 4 in the morning in the darkest part of the December night, and was a boy. A healthy, substantial boy with lungs that left no doubt about his vitality and dark hair that was damp and fine against his round head. Dr. Hargrove came out to the main room first and told Abraham, and Nora heard a sound from the other side of the door that was brief and not quite contained, and then silence, and then she heard Abraham say, very clearly, "Thank God." He came in a few minutes later and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in her arms with an expression that stripped away every habitual reserve and was simply wonder, plain and total. "He is real," he said, which was not logical as a thing to say but which she understood completely. "He is very real," she confirmed. Abraham reached out and put one finger against the baby's hand, and the baby, in the instinctive way of new infants, curled his small fingers around it, and Abraham made a sound that she would not describe later to anyone because it belonged to the private interior of that moment. "What do we name him?" he said when he had gathered himself. She had thought about names for months. She had lists. She had consulted with Abraham about the lists, and they had agreed on a short version, and she had thought she knew what she would say when the moment came. But looking at the baby and thinking about the place they had made together, from the letters and the wagon ride and the morning sunrises and the plastered wall and the fixed fence and the long evenings reading by the fire, she said, "Thomas, for the practical reasons after Dr. Hargrove, and James for your father." Abraham looked at her. "Thomas James Atkins," he said quietly, tasting the name. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Vera Walker held her great-nephew the next morning with the expression of a woman who has resolved not to cry and is managing it imperfectly, and told him in a low voice, which she probably did not realize was audible to anyone else, that he was going to be very well loved, and that this was the most important thing. She left for Cincinnati a week later, the journey timed before the deepest of winter made the roads uncertain. At the stage stop, she held Nora's hands for a long moment and said, "Write to me." "Every week," Nora promised. "And him," Vera said, meaning Abraham, who was loading her trunks onto the stage with care. "He will write too," Nora said. "He is, if you have not noticed, a good letter writer." The corner of Vera's mouth curved in a way that was as close to a smile of true warmth as Vera's face generally got. "I had noticed," she said. "That was how I knew you were going to be all right." The stage pulled away, and Nora stood in the December morning with Thomas bundled against her chest in the wrap Rosa had shown her how to make, and Abraham came to stand beside her as the stage disappeared down the Mesilla Road, and the mountains were white-capped now, and the sky was the deep winter blue she had first learned to love in September, and she felt the full weight of her life pressing warmly around her and was grateful for it in a way that was almost unbearable. "She will come back," Abraham said. "In the spring," Nora agreed. "She promised." "Good," he said. He put his arm around her shoulders, carefully, accounting for the baby, and she leaned into him, and they stood like that for a moment in the December cold before turning back toward the wagon and the road home. The years in Solace layered themselves over each other in the way that good years do, distinct in memory, but joined into something continuous and warm. Thomas grew from the dark-haired solemn infant into a dark-haired solemn toddler who spoke his first word at 11 months, which was, to Abraham's poorly concealed delight, the name of his favorite horse. He walked at 13 months and ran at 13 months and 2 days, as though walking had been merely a preliminary exercise for what he had actually intended. He had Abraham's eyes and Nora's directness, and a quality entirely his own that she did not have a precise name for, except to say that he paid attention in a way that was unusual in a small child, watching the world with a careful interest that was comfortable and not anxious. Abraham taught him to sit on a horse for the first time when he was 2, which Nora observed from the porch with her arms crossed and her face neutral, because she had decided in advance that she was not going to say anything as long as Abraham was right there with his hands on the child. And Abraham was right there the whole time, patient and unhurried. And Thomas sat on the old gray horse and regarded the view from that height with the expression of a man who has just confirmed an important hypothesis. "He likes it," Abraham said. "I can see that," Nora said. "You were worried." "I am always appropriately cautious," she said. "There is a difference." He looked at her with his quiet amusement and said, "Yes, ma'am." And she threw the kitchen rag she happened to be holding at him, which he caught without looking. She had taken on additional bookkeeping work by 1884, a development that had happened naturally when Dale Morrow, who had been struggling with his accounts for as long as anyone could remember, had found out through Rosa Vega that Nora had professional experience with bookkeeping and had come to the ranch to ask if she might be willing to help. She was willing, and the work fit neatly into the hours of the week that Thomas was napping or occupied, and the income supplemented the ranch finances in a way that she found satisfying both practically and in principle. By 1886, she was keeping books for 3 businesses in Solace, including the general store, the feed and hardware outfit, and the hotel, and her reputation for accuracy and discretion had spread to the degree that she had turned down 2 requests from Lincoln because the distance was impractical. She had developed a small but real professional standing in the community, which was not a simple thing for a woman to manage in 1886, even in a territory as practically minded as New Mexico. And she had done it by being consistently excellent and by being direct about her terms without apology. Abraham told her once that watching her work was one of his favorite things, and she had looked at him with the suspicion that it was flattery, and he had said, with complete seriousness, "I mean that. You are very good at it, and it is evident that you love it. There is something very good about watching a person do the thing they are meant to do." She had held that for a long time afterward, turning it over in her mind, because it was both true and the kind of thing she had not known she needed to hear said. Their second child came in 1886, a girl this time, born in October when the cottonwoods were gold and the mountains had their first new dusting of snow. They named her Clara, for no reason more specific than that they both liked the name and it suited her, which they determined within the first hour. Clara was everything Thomas was not in temperament, not in any difficult sense, but in the way that 2 people can be entirely opposite and entirely themselves. Where Thomas was observant and measured, Clara was immediate and emphatic. She felt everything at full volume and expressed it accordingly, and she was astonishing. Thomas was 3 when Clara was born and regarded his new sister with the expression of a senior official reviewing an important but unpredictable new appointment. After a week, he had decided in her favor and appointed himself her particular guardian, a role he took seriously for the rest of his childhood. In the autumn of 1887, 5 years after Nora had stepped off the train in Las Cruces and found Abraham standing at the platform edge with his hat in his hand so she could see his face, they did something they had been discussing for 2 years. They expanded the house. The north wall, which had been plastered twice now and was holding, was reinforced and extended, adding a full room to the east side of the building, which would be a proper bedroom for the children, and the main room was opened up slightly by relocating a wall, and the kitchen got the new stove that had been on the list since the beginning, a good cast iron range that did not fight you when you used it. Abraham and Tomas Vargas and a carpenter named Ed Buell from Solace did most of the work over 4 weeks in September and October, and Nora fed them all and kept the accounts of materials and labor, and managed the household through the upheaval with a calm efficiency that Ed Buell told his wife afterward was the most impressive domestic generalship he had ever witnessed. On the first evening after the work was finished, when Ed and Tomas had gone home and the children were asleep in their new room, and the house smelled of fresh plaster and new wood and the sawdust that had worked its way into every corner despite everyone's best efforts, Nora and Abraham sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the new stove radiating a steady warmth against the October night. And it was quiet in the way that a house is quiet when it has just been through a great deal and has settled into itself again. "Do you remember the first evening?" she said. "Beans and salt pork and cornbread," he said immediately. "You had cleaned the house for my arrival." He looked slightly abashed, which was the expression she associated with him being caught in something affectionate. "I had cleaned it twice," he said. "Once a week before and once the morning you arrived." She looked at him. "You never told me that. It seemed like the kind of thing a person does rather than announces," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen of the house they had built into something real together. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about the letter," she said. "Your letter, the first one." "The letter that did not promise you anything," he said. "Yes, I have thought about it many times, why you wrote it that way." He was quiet for a moment, his thumb moving slowly across her knuckles. "Because I had spent 5 years out here and I knew that the land does not allow dishonesty for long," he said. "If you build on a lie, the land finds it eventually and takes the whole structure down. I did not want to start that way." "You did not start that way," she said. "Neither did you." She looked at their joined hands on the table, her smaller hand in his larger one, and thought about the woman who had sat at the worn desk in Cincinnati reading 40 letters, growing more discouraged with each one, and then opening one more and laughing with surprise, and picking up her pen the same afternoon. "Abraham," she said. "Nora," he said. "I am very glad I answered." He looked at her with the full and quiet depth of a man who has built his whole life honestly and knows the value of it. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The winter of 1887 settled over the ranch and the town of Solace in the gradual way of those high desert winters, cold at night and often brilliant by day, the mountains holding their snow and the low country going tawny and still. Thomas was 4 and Clara was just over a year, and the house was warm and the stove worked as promised, and the evenings had a completeness to them that Nora had not been able to imagine when she was sitting at the desk in Cincinnati, but which, having arrived at it, she recognized as the thing she had been reaching toward without knowing what she was reaching for. She wrote to Vera every week as promised, and Vera had come back to Solace the previous spring as she had said she would, and had stayed for 2 months, and had taken Thomas on walks around the ranch in the mornings with the air of a woman seriously engaged in the task of teaching a small person to pay attention to the world, which she was. She had held Clara for long periods with an expression that had gradually abandoned any pretense of reserve and become simply tender. She had helped Nora with the spring garden planting and had argued constructively with Abraham about the best variety of dry bean for the altitude, and had been proven partly right, which she did not gloat about because she was not the gloating kind, but she had permitted herself one very small nod when the harvest confirmed her. When Vera left at the end of May, she had hugged Nora for longer than usual and said, in a voice that was steady only by force of will, "This is a good life you have made here. I want you to know that I can see it." "I know you can see it," Nora had said. "You always could." The letters continued. They would always continue, because Nora was a person who had learned the value of letters, and because the distance between Cincinnati and Solace was real and needed to be bridged by something more than time. In 1888, Sheriff Glendon retired, and there was a small formal supper in his honor at the hotel, attended by most of Solace, at which he gave a speech that was mostly about the importance of decent fences and their metaphorical applications to community life, and which was received with the warmth due a man who had genuinely worked to keep the town in good order. His replacement was a younger man named Calvin Reyes, who had been his deputy for 3 years and who was steady and fair, and had grown up partly in Texas and partly in the territory, and understood the country. Nora found in the spring of 1888 that she was expecting again. She told Abraham on a morning very like the morning she had told him about Thomas, in the kitchen, with the garden coming up outside the window. His response was essentially identical to the first time. The stillness, the carefully set down coffee cup, the coming to her, the hands on her face. "Are you well?" he said first, which was the right first thing. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and kissed her forehead, and then stood holding her for a long minute in the spring kitchen, and she could feel the depth of his feeling without needing to name it. This third child was another boy, born in November 1888, and they named him David, and he arrived with the same vigor that had characterized Thomas's arrival, and was, from the first hours, a child of considerable opinions. Thomas, now 5, received him with magnanimous seriousness. Clara, too, prodded him with one exploratory finger, and announced a judgment in her own language that was not yet fully English, but was clearly positive. The ranch in 1889 had grown to 85 head of cattle, and the finances were the steadiest they had been in the 7 years since Nora had arrived and begun reorganizing the accounts. A reasonable run of decent rains had kept the grass good for 3 consecutive years. The prices at the Lincoln market had been fair, and the operation of two people working together with genuine competence and genuine partnership had produced results that neither of them would have managed alone. Abraham bought a second horse for the ranch, a young bay stallion that he was training carefully and slowly, and the morning he first rode the horse the full length of the south pasture and back without trouble, he came in with his face open in the particular way of a man who has done something difficult well, and she was standing on the porch and she clapped, and he looked both pleased and embarrassed. And she loved him very much in that moment, with a sharp and present feeling that years of daily life had not dulled at all. She thought about that sometimes, the persistent brightness of it, and decided it was because they had not built their life on promises that might have dimmed when they proved impossible. They had built it on the actual material of their days, the real work and the real difficulty, and the real conversation, and the real love that was both feeling and practice at once. There was nothing to be disappointed by because there had never been a false picture to compare the reality against. She wrote this, or some version of it, to her Aunt Vera in a long letter in the autumn of 1889, not because she thought Vera needed to be told, but because writing it helped her understand it more clearly. Vera wrote back, as she always did, with precision and without sentiment, and with all the sentiment fully present underneath. She wrote, "What you are describing is what I hoped for when I suggested you answer that last letter. I did not tell you to answer it. I only suggested you might consider it. I was glad when you did not need my opinion to make up your own mind." Nora read this twice, and then laughed, and then felt the particular warmth of being known by someone who has watched you become yourself. Thomas started school in the fall of 1889, walking down the lane every morning with his lunch pail and his slate with the seriousness of a person embarking on important work, which was how he approached most things. He was reading already, which had surprised his teacher and perhaps should not have, given the quantity of books in the house, and the fact that both his parents read constantly and had been reading to him since before he could understand the words. Clara would start the following year, and David the year after that, and Nora had already spoken with the school teacher, a young woman named Miss Eubanks who was from Missouri, and who had come to the territory on her own terms with her own purposes, about the possibility of the children having access to additional books beyond the school's modest library. Miss Eubanks had been very interested in this conversation, and it had extended from a brief greeting into an hour of discussion about books and education, and what the territory's children needed that they were not receiving. And by the end of it, Nora had agreed to lend the school her own books on a rotating basis, and Miss Eubanks had agreed to write to 3 Eastern publishing houses about donation programs that existed for frontier schools. It was the kind of small practical collaboration that Nora had discovered over the years in Solace was how most good things actually got done. In the evenings now the house had more sound in it, the 3 children at different stages of their days, Thomas coming home from school with things to report, Clara conducting a running commentary on the world that was by now entirely in English and very detailed, David pulling himself along the floor with the concentrated determination of a person who intends to walk very soon and is merely completing the administrative prerequisites. Abraham would come in from the evening work, and the noise and the warmth of it would receive him, and she watched his face receive it, the way the day fell away from him when he came through the door, and the house closed around him. One evening in early December of 1889, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Abraham sat down across from her at the table with the lamp between them as they had done so many evenings, and he said, "Do you ever think about the letters?" She looked up from the sock she was mending. "I think about your letter," she said, "the first one, the one that did not promise you anything." "Yes." He looked at the lamp for a moment. "I was so careful writing that letter," he said. "I had started it 4 times. Every time I started it the way you were supposed to start it, with the house and the land and the prospects, and every time I got a few lines in and stopped because it felt wrong. It felt like I was describing a position and not a person." "You were right that it felt wrong," she said. "So I started it again and I wrote the only thing I knew how to say, which was, 'This is what it actually is, and I understand if that is not what you are looking for.'" He looked at her. "I did not expect you to answer." "Why not?" "Because every other woman would have reasonable grounds not to. The house was a mess. The prospects were uncertain. The man was entirely unknown. I did not give you anything to hold on to." "You gave me honesty," she said. "That was everything to hold on to." He looked at her for a long moment across the table with the lamp between them and the children asleep in the east room and the winter night quiet outside the thick adobe walls. "I have never been able to give you enough of the other things," he said. "The fine house or the easy life or the certainty." "Abraham," she said. "Let me say it," he said, not defensively but with the seriousness of a man completing a thought. "I know the ranch is good now. I know we have built something real. But there are still hard years. There will be hard years again, and I want you to know that I know the difference between what I offered and what some men could have offered, and I am grateful every day that you chose this." She put the mending down on the table. "You did not offer me nothing," she said. "You offered me the truth. Do you understand how rare that was? I had read 39 letters from men who offered me things that were not real, and then I read one letter from a man who told me the truth, and the truth was more than all of those things put together." She held his gaze. "I did not come to New Mexico territory for a fine house. I came because I thought you might be a person I could build something real with, and you were, and we did, and I would make that choice again tomorrow and every day after that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I love you, Nora Atkins." "I love you, Abraham Atkins," she said, with the full conviction of a woman who has tested the thing she is saying against 7 years of daily life and found it not only intact but stronger than it was at the beginning. Outside, the December wind moved through the cottonwoods by the lane, the old trees that had been there when she arrived, and which she had grown to love as markers of the place, the way certain things become markers of a life. The mountains to the east were invisible in the dark, but she knew exactly where they were. She had learned the shape of this country, the feel of its seasons, the smell of its particular earth. It was hers in the way that only the things you have chosen and worked for and loved honestly are yours. She picked up the mending again. He got up and put another piece of wood in the stove, and the fire adjusted and settled, and the lamp made its small circle of warmth, and they sat in it together. And the house held them, and outside the stars were beginning to appear in the cold, clear winter sky, more stars than she had ever imagined before she came here. The same sky she had stood under with Abraham on her first night in Solace, the sky that letters could not prepare you for. She thought about the woman at the worn desk in Cincinnati, tired from 40 letters that said the same things in different arrangements, reaching for one more envelope with diminishing faith. She thought about the feeling of opening that last letter, the single page, the plain handwriting, the honest words that did not promise anything. She thought about writing back the same afternoon. There were things in life, she had come to understand, that you recognized before you could explain them, the way you recognized the quality of light before you had words for the hour of the day. She had recognized something in that letter, in the absence of promise, that she had been looking for without knowing its name. She had recognized a man who understood that the truth was not a smaller thing than a promise. It was, in fact, the only real thing there was to offer. The lamp burned on. The children slept. Abraham read, his face calm in the light, one hand resting on the table near where her hand was. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the cold wind, and the stars moved overhead in their ancient arcs, and in the New Mexico territory in December of 1889, In a house that had been built and repaired and extended and filled with life over 7 years, Nora Walker Atkins was entirely, completely at home. She had answered 40 letters. His was the only one that had not promised her anything, and it had given her everything.